The light in the chamber of cogitation was not light at all, but a smeared, bruised orange glow emanating from a billion malfunctioning indicator lamps. It was the color of dying stars and spilled viscera, the constant, oppressive hue of Sector Gamma 9's primary manufactorum. Here, where the air itself tasted of ozone, burned lubricant, and the slow decay of ancient metal, knelt Archmagos Dominus Valerius, 77. He was less man, more monument to agonizing devotion. His organic structure had been reduced to a pale, withered core housed deep within a carapace of blackened ceramite and pulsing servomotors. The remaining flesh was a roadmap of unnecessary life support tubing and redundant nutrient feeds. The machine god, Omnicia, had demanded sacrifice, and Valerius, 77 had offered everything, piece by agonizing piece, until only the will remained, a will perpetually tuned to the discordant hymns of the Omnicia's great code. For 3 standard centuries, Valerius, 77 had managed the output of Gamma 9, a facility responsible for producing the sacred Lehman Russ battle tanks that were the iron fist of the Astra Militarum. But the quota for the current solar cycle was short. Critically short. The astropathic transmission had been flagged with the highest priority crimson seal, a sector-wide uprising threatened to sever the vital agri-worlds, and the tanks were needed to smash the heresy before it took root. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not tolerate failure, especially failure born of mechanical insufficiency. Failure was the first step toward heresy. Valerius, 77 focused his multi-lensed optical cluster onto the primary diagnostic screen, a sheet of rippling, semi-sentient liquid crystal that displayed the spiritual integrity of every piece of equipment under his command. The data was a nightmare rendered in cold mathematics. The massive stamping presses, the plasma forges, even the automated assembly arms, all were reporting cognitive dissonance, a polite euphemism for mechanical reluctance, bordering on outright refusal. The spirit of the machine was weary. It had been forced to digest too much unholy data, too many cheap scrap components jury-rigged to meet impossible deadlines set by distant, ignorant sector lords that he flexed one of his primary manipulator arms, a massive assembly ending in a 10-pronged pincer capable of crushing ferrocrete. The motion was accompanied by a grinding shriek of ancient gears protesting their exertion. "Patience, my children," his internal monologue resonated, a sterile voice devoid of warmth. The Omnicia requires perfection. But perfection required resources, and resources were finite. The last shipment of true cogitator cores, blessed by the Martian hierophants, had been diverted to the orbital defense platforms weeks ago. Valerius, 77 was left with the tainted, the salvaged, the near-heretical components scavenged from defunct, ancient land crawlers that he initiated the litany of recalibration through his vocoder, a series of high-frequency clicks and metallic groans that were prayer, command, and diagnostic sweep all in one. The robotic drones scurrying around the chamber, their limbs replaced by vacuum tubes and crude oil feeders, paused their maintenance, awaiting instruction. Valerius, 77 needed a miracle, or failing that, a massive infusion of spiritual and physical power. He knew where to find the power. The machine god demanded sacrifice, and Valerius, 77 was prepared to offer the only resource he had in abundance, the lesser servitors who maintained the periphery of the manufactorum. Their minds were already hollowed out, their flesh prededicated. Their sacrifice would be painless to the machine, and perhaps, cleansing for Valerius 77's own troubled logic circuits. The command was simple, cold, and absolute: isolate the lowest caste, designate them for immediate integration. The drones obeyed instantly, their collective purpose overriding any vestige of confusion or hesitation. They flowed like a tide of greasy metal toward the lower maintenance tunnels where the unaugmented human laborers and low-caste servitors performed their tedious, repetitive tasks. Valerius, 77 remained in the orange gloom, listening to the sounds of the ritual beginning. The grinding of the heavy blast doors sealing the primary manufacturing floor was followed by the rhythmic, heavy clang of ceremonial impact hammers, the signal that the integration process had begun. This was the true, grim liturgy of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the transmutation of base matter, biological or otherwise, into the necessary components for the war machine. He directed his attention to the central issue, forge line delta, responsible for engine manifolds. The dissonance there was so severe that the assembly arms were locking up mid-weld. Valerius, 77 knew the cause. A microfracture in the spirit of the line's controlling cogitator required a direct, physical intervention, a surgical application of faith and fire. He activated the magnetic locks on his chassis, preparing to move. His own heavy, multi-limbed form was not built for delicate work, but it was built for endurance. As he traversed the vast, echoing floor, his ocular cluster registered a disturbance near the main coolant intake, an unregistered lifeform signature. This was impossible. Gamma 9 was a quarantine zone, sealed against external contamination and internal rebellion alike. He angled a peripheral lens toward the source, a narrow maintenance crawlspace usually reserved for cleaning drones. Huddled within the shadows was a young Skitarii legionary, barely augmented, his face a mask of terror beneath his stained veil. The young soldier was clutching a cracked data slate, not weapons. Valerius, 77 halted, his metallic limbs freezing mid-stride. He extended a specialized sensor probe, a thin, articulated filament tipped with microscopic analysis tools, toward the intruder. The probe touched the Skitarii's shoulder plating, transmitting a surge of diagnostic data directly into the tech priest's mind. The soldier was not a threat, he was a refugee, clearly fleeing the very integration ritual Valerius, 77 had just ordered. The data slate he held was not military schematics, but forbidden texts, fragments of pre-imperial philosophy, romantic poetry, and, worst of all, unfiltered data on the nature of the omnisia, data that suggested the machine god was merely an advanced form of artificial intelligence, not a deity. This was not mere insubordination, it was soul blasphemy. The concept of choice in relation to the sacred calculus of the forge was an infection. Valerius, 77 felt a flicker, a non-logical hesitation, in his own ancient circuitry. It was the ghost of the man he once was, the biologist who studied fragile organic life before embracing the purity of steel. This hesitation was instantly flagged by his internal security protocols as a potential flaw. The machine god would not tolerate even a shadow of doubt. The Skitarii had to be purged, not for treason, but for carrying the idea of heresy. Valerius, 77 retracted the probe, its sensors having already tagged the youth for immediate mind scouring and subsequent conversion into a low-power, non-sentient relay tower. The sacrifice was becoming layered, the purging of the Skitarii was swift and noiseless, a mere interruption in the symphony of grinding metal. The young soldier's body was efficiently disassembled by a trio of heavy-duty cleaning drones, his organic matter recycled into bioslurry for the furnace, and his precious augmetics stripped for immediate recalibration. Valerius, 77 continued toward Forge Line Delta, the glow of the indicator lamps seeming to intensify as he approached the area of critical failure. The air grew hotter, thick with the smell of scorching insulation, the mechanical equivalent of a fever. When he arrived, the scene was one of impotent chaos. The assembly arms, usually precise instruments of creation, were twitching erratically, their heavy pistons slamming against empty gantries. One arm had actually begun to attempt to weld two unrelated structural beams together, creating a useless, molten knot of metal, an act of pure mechanical psychosis. Valerius, 77 extended two of his auxiliary arms. One carried a heavy, lead-line data casket containing the holy schematics, the other a complex array of energy conduits meant for direct neural linkage. He had to override the main cogitator, which meant exposing his own core logic systems to the raw, corrupted data flowing through the line. This was the ultimate sacrifice, risking his own mind to heal the collective. He carefully plugged the data casket into the cogitator's main access port, initiating a low-level data quarantine, then attached the thick, humming neural conduit directly to a junction point on his own neck plating. The surge was immediate and brutal. It was not simply data, it was rage, exhaustion, and the fragmented, terrified consciousness of thousands of integrated servitors screaming silently through the network. Valerius, 77 perceived the history of Forge Line Delta in an instant, the cutting of corners, the replacement of blessed oils with cheap substitutes, the unspoken exhaustion of the slaves who maintained the cooling systems. He felt the raw need of the machines, the need for rest, for true maintenance, for a moment of silence where the omnisia's commands were not constantly screamed into their processors. He forced his will against the tide. Silence, he projected, his voice amplified through the cogitator's speakers, overriding the static. You are vessels. You serve the Emperor's will through the omnisia. Resist is heresy. Integrate the correction. He didn't just input data, he poured his own augmented willpower, his centuries of absolute obedience, into the system. For a moment, the metal screamed louder, resisting the imposition of a mind that was still, terrifyingly, rooted in the ghost of human flesh. Sparks flew from the connection point. Valerius, 77, felt a burning sensation behind his remaining organic eye, a sign of severe strain. Then, as suddenly as it began, the resistance buckled. The twitching stopped. The assembly arms settled into perfect, synchronized stillness. The orange glow on the diagnostic screen above the line shifted, resolving itself into a solid, stable green, the color of machine purity. The immediate crisis was averted, the quota now achievable, but the cost to Valerius, 77, was significant. He had momentarily linked with the suffering of the unfeeling, and the echo of that collective pain resonated deep within his core programming. The successful recalibration of Forge Line Delta brought a temporary sense of sterile accomplishment. The massive stamping presses began their rhythmic thud hiss, driving the armored plates into shape for the next batch of Lehman Russ chassis. The noise, once a grating cacophony of malfunction, had returned to the monotonous, comforting heartbeat of industry. Valerius, 77, slowly disconnected the neural conduit, the withdrawal leaving him feeling cold and hollowed out. His internal diagnostics flagged several minor but persistent hardware errors in his own chassis, a direct consequence of channeling that much raw, corrupted system feedback. These would require ritualistic replacement, a process that would take weeks and consume more precious resources. That he surveyed the remaining error reports. The true bottleneck was now the plasma conduit weavers in Sector Epsilon. These automated stations were responsible for integrating the volatile energy cores into the tank engines. The failure there was systemic, not isolated, it was a spreading logical rot. The spiritual purity of the conduits was degrading faster than they could be blessed. Valerius, 77, knew what this implied. The supply of consecrated oils used in the pre-integration blessing ritual had been exhausted, and the replacement batch from the nearest temple world had been destroyed en route by a minor orc incursion. The official ruling from the sector Hierophant was to use purified hydrosolvent as a temporary substitute until replacements arrived in 4 standard months. Hydrosolvent was anathema, it cleaned too well. It stripped away the layers of accrued ritualistic energy, the very soul, that allowed the components to interface with the machine god's complex will. Using it was a form of heresy by proxy, a dangerous cleansing that risked revealing the raw, unpredictable mathematics beneath the faith, but the tanks were needed in 4 weeks. Valerius, 77, ordered the immediate transfer of all available processing power to the scrutiny bays, locking down all non-essential functions. He had to perform the ultimate blasphemy to achieve the ultimate obedience. He would not use the solvent. He would attempt to transfer a portion of his own, ancient, battle-forged mechanical spirit, the residue of his own humanity, painstakingly layered with centuries of dogma, directly into the conduits as they were being forged. It was a technique only spoken of in the deepest, most forbidden tracks of the Lex Mechanicus, a practice that dissolved the Archmagosa's very essence into the production line, permanently sacrificing his individual continuity for the sake of the quota. He activated his long-range transport crane, guiding it toward the massive, immobile housing of the oldest functioning plasma weaver, Unit Omega Prime. The crane lowered a massive, tungsten-tipped needle toward a rarely opened maintenance hatch on the weaver's main core. Valerius, 77, knew that if this worked, the tanks would be blessed with the fervor of a Martian archmagos. If it failed, the resulting feedback cascade would vaporize the entire manufacturing sector, sending a localized warp rift straight through Gamma 9 and gifting Slaanesh with a very interesting new toy. The machine god demanded sacrifice. Valerius, 77, was ready to become the sacrifice. The transfer commenced not with a triumphant surge, but with a sound like tearing silk magnified 1,000 times through iron speakers. Valerius, 77, felt the spiritual anchor point snap. The tungsten needle bit deep into the core of Unit Omega Prime, and the flow began. It was not a gentle transfer of codified faith, it was a violent siphoning of self. Centuries of accumulated prayers, diagnostics, logic trees, and the faint, buried memories of his original, human self, the man who loved astronomy before he loved gears, were ripped away. The immediate effect on the plasma conduit weavers was astounding. Instead of resisting, the machinery roared to life with an almost manic zeal. The plasma conduits were not merely being blessed, they were being infused with an alien, powerful sense of purpose that transcended standard programming. The resulting energy cores hummed with a pure, incandescent blue light, far brighter and more stable than any legally produced component. The machines were running on the engine of a dying godman. Valerius 77's optical lenses began to dim, the complex overlays of data fading into monochrome fuzz. His motor controls became sluggish, responding to his mental commands with a delay that felt like an eternity. He was aware, clinically aware, that he was collapsing from the inside out. The energy transfer was draining the necessary biological material that kept his remaining organs functioning, the fragile, despised flesh that the machine god permitted him to keep only for the act of ultimate service that he forced his remaining functional manipulator arm to move, tapping out a final, fragmented command sequence onto a secure terminal that would transmit the production data back to Mars. The message was simple, stripped of all the usual liturgical padding, quota met. Spirit transferred. Maintenance required. As the last tank engine core was slotted perfectly into place by a weaver burning with Valerius 77's own life force, the orange light of the manufactorum finally began to fade. The roar of the machinery dropped to a low, steady purr, the sound of perfect, tireless efficiency. Valerius 77 slumped against the housing of Omega Prime, his massive form finally still. His final sensation was not pain, but the profound, absolute silence in his own head, the silence that comes when the noise of self is finally extinguished. The drones, having completed their required integration task, the conversion of the lowest servitors, now returned to their assigned maintenance routines, passing the still form of their master without pause or recognition. They registered him only as a large, inert piece of decommissioned heavy equipment blocking a primary thoroughfare. The quota was met. The sacrifice was complete. The machine god was pleased, and the Lehman Russ tanks, fueled by the essence of their creator, rolled off the line, ready to bring righteous, terrible violence to the heretics in the outer darkness, utterly unaware of the sheer, agonizing humanity that had just been burned away to forge their engines of war. The light in Sector Gamma 9 had finally gone dark, leaving only the cold, beautiful glow of newly made weaponry.